Welcome to EVONA Origin Stories, the space podcast where we look to bring you extraordinary leaders from within the sector and their fascinating stories of early life, career, and how they broke into the space industry.
We've got a great episode for you this week as we speak with Patrick Shannon, engineer, entrepreneur, self-professed sci-fi nerd, and the CEO of TrustPoint. The work that TrustPoint are doing is really groundbreaking. They are essentially commercialising GPS, developing an alternative global navigation satellite system. The company was only established in 2020, but they're already making enormous waves across the industry. As a lifelong lover of space with a childhood dream of becoming an engineer, Patrick shares some really great advice for anybody looking to break their way into the industry.
Well, hello, Patrick. Welcome to the podcast. Very excited to have you here.
Likewise, excited to be here. Thank you for the invite.
Oh, you're very welcome. Our pleasure. So, if you don't mind, we'll start from the beginning. I think it's a great place to begin your story.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So let's start with kind of the early days of Patrick Shannon. So talk us through where you started in life, where you grew up, school, college, and then how you found your way into your early career.
Yeah, absolutely. So I grew up in the Boston area, north of Boston. My family's from that area of the world. And I guess you could say as a kid, I was big into science fiction and got into some model rocketry at one point. Kind of the common things you might see a middle schooler or an early high schooler getting into. Of course, as you get on through the last couple of years of high school, you start saying, okay, what am I going to do with my life? And it was a very easy transition to say, okay, I'm going to go into engineering of some sort. So that's what I did. Applied to a bunch of engineering schools. Was very fortunate enough to get into MIT. So just hopped in a car and drove down towards Boston. About 35 minutes from where my parents live and where I grew up, and did my undergrad at MIT in aerospace engineering. So course 16 for those who are familiar with the numbering system they use there. I guess from the MIT standpoint, I actually had my eyes set on going into the Air Force. So I did aerospace engineering, did Air Force ROTC for a period. I was very bullish on going into the military and initially going into like acquisitions, working on like classified satellite stuff. That was kind of one thing that I found pretty interesting. Roundabout way, did not end up doing that, but did end up working early on in my career on classified satellite work. So joined a company called Orbital Sciences, coming out of MIT, moved down to the DC area, and got to leverage that aerospace degree, doing satellite systems engineering actually to start. So looking at the big system level, doing a lot of conceptual design work, requirements, system level integration, concepts, and actually some newer system development as well, from the ideas of how do you build systems for satellites that the U.S. government in particular could buy in different ways. So that's kind of like the start of my career. The thing I'll also point out is there was a big component, and I'm sure tons of folks in the aerospace industry have this big component of my, personal interests came through science fiction. And very early on, I was introduced to Isaac Asimov and some of these other authors that have kind of written these kind of pivotal science fiction novels and things over the last century, Jules Verne and the like. And that piqued a lot of interest as well. That also kind of factored in. It was like, hey, these guys are very futuristic. They're looking forward. I want to help build that type of future. So there's a big component of my early career wrapped up in that as well.
Yeah, definitely. Joe, that's something interesting. Interestingly, but not surprisingly, we hear from, I think, the majority of people we've had on here when we kind of start on the early days of their life. I was so into sci-fi as a child, and it's such a nice kind of story when we're speaking to people in the height of their success, when they've really achieved these goals, and we talk about when they were a child, and it's so interesting to hear that you didn't quite know what you wanted to do, but you knew a general direction you were going in, and from just a kid loving sci-fi to all of the kind of different things you were exposed to when you were going on this journey. You didn't take the path you necessarily thought, but look where you are now, making big change.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Definitely. So that's your story and so that's your early career, which obviously now we're at TrustPoint. I think it would be really good to kind of tell our listeners a bit about TrustPoint, what they do, how they fit into the sector, and also kind of where you see them being in the next 5 years.
Yeah, great question. So, I'll actually give maybe 30 seconds leading into TrustPoint because kind of there's a nice ramp into it. So I was at Orbital Sciences, was doing some engineering work, ended up doing some proposal work and business development, and then ended up working at a corporate strategy. And so I was able to see kind of the life cycle of an aerospace business, understanding, throughout a couple of year time frame, how does that company do R&D? How do they do systems? How do they do sales? How do they do strategy, finance? And that started kind of piquing my interest towards the business side of aerospace. And I spent a couple of years working for a small company after Orbital in DC on kind of microsatellites and just cutting my teeth in the kind of the commercial space world. Used that to go do some grad school, did grad school at Stanford, and then have been living in Silicon Valley ever since. And in Silicon Valley, after graduating from grad school, it's all been aerospace startup work, both as a consultant and an executive. And primarily I always knew at that point, kind of coming out of grad school, that I wanted to be an aerospace CEO of some sort, right? And that can take a lot of different permutations. There's a lot of experience I needed to go get, a lot of network I needed to build. And all of that kind of culminated with the founding of TrustPoint. But just prior to TrustPoint, got a chance to build a lot of spacecraft, CubeSat and microsat class. Did a bunch more sales work, helped a company with their strategy, pivoting as a consultant. So I had some really great experiences, and all of that culminated in the founding of TrustPoint. And TrustPoint was founded, we are a commercial GPS company. So I'll start right there, right? TrustPoint is a commercial GPS company. We're going to be building a constellation of over 300 spacecraft to provide new and innovative GPS-like signals, right? So we use GPS day in, day out for everything, right? It's not just how we navigate to, a restaurant we haven't been to before and how we get around a town we haven't been in before, but it's also our global timing synchronization service. It's how all of our wireless networks stay synchronized and have such good data capacity. There's a big component of it, obviously, in the military. And there's massive components also just in kind of consumer and civil services. And you start thinking about gaming, you start thinking about future of augmented reality, and we see a big opportunity there. So, from the TrustPoint perspective, how are we going to help enable that? So we're building kind of the infrastructure layer and providing a new set of signals. And historically, the U.S. government and other governments around the world have been in charge of that portion of the program, right? The Air Force puts up satellites, they provide the signals they want to provide, and then the commercial civil world have to figure out how to use those to the best of their ability. And that constellation gets refreshed. But there's not a ton of control over it. There's not a ton of innovation just because the life cycles are long. Today, a lot of people aren't aware of this. Today, there are 7 GPS spacecraft in the constellation that date back to the 90s, right? So the technology is really old, and they're fantastic spacecraft. Don't get me wrong, right? For a spacecraft to last over 20 years in an operational state, even if slightly degraded, is fantastic engineering feat. But we want fast iterations. We want evolutionary capability, and that's what TrustPoint's intended to bring to the scene, right? We can iterate fast. We can replenish a constellation fast. We can build low cost, proliferated systems, and really improve upon capability. So that's what TrustPoint's about. Now, you asked where do you see us in 5 years? I see us being an owner and an operator of a constellation that has 300-ish satellites in it. Providing this global service of time and position, and really helping enable or proliferate a lot of cool applications that can't meet, or can't do what they need to do with existing GPS, right? And some of those applications I've kind of hit on, but like autonomous navigation is a big one, both on the land when you think of self-driving cars, as well as in the air when you think of drones, drone delivery. Urban air mobility is another big one that's very interested in this new capability. Those are the flying taxis. Augmented reality, I think, is going to be big. When we start talking about going from something like Pokemon Go, right, where you have a phone walking around a town or a city collecting Pokemon, great. But what would be way cooler is if you were doing that with augmented reality glasses, right, and had hyper precision capability in those glasses, so you could see a virtual environment superimposed on the real one and have an enjoyable, entertaining experience from that. So that's another thing I think that we're going to help proliferate. And some of the technologies we're doing should make the receiver smaller, the antenna smaller, more low power, cheaper, and all of those things factor into kind of enabling a lot of these applications. So in 5 years, hopefully we've got a bunch of customers across those sectors. We have 300 plus spacecraft up there. We're providing a global service. We're a global company with, hopefully offices on a couple of different continents. And yeah, I'd be super excited if we could do that in the next 5 years.
Oh, I think it sounds like you will achieve that. I think everyone at home, the thought of an augmented reality Pokemon Go, I think that's a really great example for people. I think they don't really realize how much this technology is so ingrained into everything we do. When you open your phone, if you're lost, if you're trying to get home, it's all completely reliant on this. And something that which you touched on, was really interested to read was that a lot of these kind of like these systems and the satellite constellations we have are based on concepts from the 70s and 80s and then were commercially deployed in the 90s. And I think that to me was quite surprising, because you'd think it was, being constantly updated, and it was, I think it was made much more recently than that. So I think it makes perfect sense for a company like yours to kind of, to develop this technology so it can keep up with modern life, because it is starting to sound a bit outdated when you get the dates into it.
Yeah, exactly. And we're not going to knock the defense industry. They make exquisite systems and they pursue these requirements, but it is slow and it's expensive. And there's a lot of the world that don't need that level of system. And I think after a couple iterations, a generation or two of our constellation, we will have the same level of capability at the component and subsystem level that these big guys have. But we'll still be able to do it for a fraction of the cost. And that all comes through iterative design and development, right? Which their iterations are on the order of 7 to 10 years, sometimes 15 years, right? So if you would assume, and this is just back of the envelope, but let's say every generation of satellite is 10 times better than the previous one, right? GPS has only had two iterations of really designed for a full system. They've had a couple of generations of spacecraft, but for the most part, you've kind of replenished the constellation 1.5 times. And so they only have maybe a 10x increase in total capability. A commercial company that does that every 2 to 3 years or every 3 to 4 years, right, in that same 20-year time frame, is going to have something that's much closer to 1,000x, right, or 10,000x of the capability, just because of how they improve and they're able to bring in technologies from other sectors, iterate on the design, keep things flowing, moving forward, building momentum around that new technology. Learning from it and doing it all over again.
Yeah, completely. Absolutely. Not to bash the military. That's not what I was trying to do.
Yeah, we love those guys.
Great. Not my intention at all. But, it's times are changing so rapidly, more so than ever, especially when it comes to satellite technologies, as you said, with kind of microsats and CubeSats. And, since the 70s, 80s, 90s, I feel like hundreds of years have passed in the way that we're kind of developing and the things we're able to achieve. So this is very exciting work that you're at the forefront of. I can't even imagine.
Oh yeah. It's exciting stuff.
Yeah, very exciting. This kind of brings me on to, it's a bit of a more of a broad question, but I feel that we've touched on, you've had some very comprehensive experience that's kind of led you to where you are today. You obviously have a passion for so many things across the industry, STEM in general, so many industries that you've kind of been involved in. Now that you're very much embedded into the industry, you've made this name for yourself, you're doing amazing things. What would you say is that you love the most about the space sector in general?
Yeah, I think it's like the massive aspiration the space sector has, right? And that's not unique to space. There's a lot of sectors that have these far-ranging visions. But it's hard to compete with, a vision that includes things like settling Mars and traveling to other stars and, potentially getting out to a place where we might, find, life beyond our solar system. And that level of aspiration, which is not something we'll achieve in the next 10 years or the next 100, maybe not the next 1,000, maybe not the next 10,000, right? And hopefully we're still around to do that type of thing in the future. But the goals are so big that it's really exciting, right? And that massive aspiration, I think, is really interesting and a major kind of thread in the space industry. And it's kind of an underlying, source of energy, I think, for a lot of people that are in it, to some extent, right? It's one thing, I think there's a big difference, if you just take the rocket community maybe 10 years ago, right? A mid or junior engineer working for ULA, Lockheed, or Boeing, working on exquisite technologies, for the Delta IV, the Atlas V launch vehicle, right? Nothing wrong with that, fantastic vehicle, right? But the aspiration there is to put up another defense spacecraft, right? Or to solidify your supply chain to be more US centric for national security purposes, right? Very important, very valuable. But that same job, right? Whether they're working on a turbo pump or, some avionics cards. That same job at SpaceX has a whole different appeal, right? You're building an avionics card or a turbo pump or, a structural bracket even, right? That's intending to be a small step on the path to Mars colonization. And it's just a very different feel and drive behind that activity. And I think that goes across like the communication sector. It's different between building, an old school geo communication satellite versus some of these new, LEO mega broadband, mega constellations doing broadband and other things of that nature. So yeah, it's pretty cool.
Yeah, I completely agree. And it's so nice to hear you talk about that, because I completely agree. Everyone I speak to in this industry, I think the common denominator and the kind of underlying factor is this passion, and as you say, the aspiration for exploration and discovery and what is possible, which seems so impossible, but it's not, because we're doing it, and there's so many incredible things going on, and it's kind of what unites the sector. And it's so great to speak to all these people who are so passionate, and how can you not be when you're talking about space and what is possible? And I think it nicely ties into what we spoke about at the beginning, and it always seems to stem back to childhood and this love for exploration that people have, that kind of it ties so well into kind of a future career in this industry. And that brings me on to kind of quite an important topic that at EVONA we're very passionate about. I'm sure you've heard us talk about this before. So one of the reason we even started this podcast in the first place is to make space accessible for everyone by, talking to people like you, getting your backstory, what you love about the sector. It's so great for people to hear. One hot topic across the industry right now is kind of the battle for good talent, and what more we can be doing to kind of nurture that within the industry so that it can continue to progress alongside humanity. We personally, and I know this is very common view across the industry, believe that we kind of need to be impacting this change at a lower level for young children, whatever age they are, whatever school they're in, having STEM activities, these lower level STEM activities, to get these young people inspired, to get them thinking about what's possible, what they could do with their lives, and to follow that and not let, anything that comes along the way as you start growing up kind of deter you from doing that. So yeah, just kind of ensure the sector's growth into the future, how we can be kind of influencing young children. What are your thoughts on that, and what do you feel that we could be doing differently, maybe across the industry and at STEM level, to kind of impact change for the sector now as well as for future generations?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean,
the big one.
Yeah, it is a big one, and there's a couple points I'll make there. So I think the first one, and I think it's just the easy one, especially with younger kids, is the science fiction side of things. And I'm not saying we should go out and promote science fiction, but I think it'd be valuable to draw a difference between, kind of pie in the sky science fiction, of which there are plenty. I would say Star Wars is in that particular grouping, and hard science fiction. And hard science fiction is more like The Martian, written by Andy Weir and then made into a movie with Matt Damon. It was a fantastic example of something that's in the future, but very tangible, right? Like we're not that far from that. And it gives people a very clear vision of where we might be. And it's digestible more so for those younger audiences, right? Than trying to say, hey, go, study math and science, right? Like that's not fun. That's not necessarily something they want to spend their weekends or their night doing. They want to go play video games. But if you give them some content like that and help point them in the direction of things that are a little visionary, but also, realistic. I think that would help, right? I think that's interesting and valuable to those younger generations. The other thing I would say, has to do with like tangible projects, and I would say that this is like way better now than it was, when I was growing up, right? When I was growing up, you could buy an erector set, you'd play with Kinects and Legos, but there wasn't really a whole lot beyond saying like Lego Technics, if anyone remembers that, in the way of like robotics or programming, right? Like I went to a computer camp one summer for a couple of days to learn C++, and that was pretty cool. That was insightful. And it gave me a sense into how computers work. But there wasn't a lot of opportunity for that. Today we have things like Raspberry Pi and Arduinos. We've got all sorts of different robotics kits. People can build little websites. And I think those things are fun and valuable and super kind of a super good way to get people close to technology, right? Like STEM, it's not a book, it's not a classroom, right? It's an implementation of something. And you can do that through projects. And so I would say, one of the other big things is, help schools or communities, or even, your own household have project-oriented stuff on hand, right? Buy Estes rockets, buy Arduinos, put them on the table and let the kids play with them. And then I would say that also kind of sets the stage for what I might recommend for high schoolers and college students, right? So there's a ton of people that do STEM in college, right? Get an engineering degree or a science degree, and then go off and do different things, whether it's business or teaching or, join the military, do other things. And there's nothing wrong with the other topics, but I feel like there was a big gap, at least in my kind of cohort in college, that we did have project work, but we weren't tied in with industry well. And one of the things I did early on in my career, which one of my mentors told me to go do, is self-fund conference attendance, right? So a lot of times you show at a company, you say, hey, boss, I want to go to a conference. And they're like, okay, write a paper. Or, maybe when you get promoted, right? Maybe we're going to send someone that's a little older. And that's all well and good for the company. It's probably the best for the company. But I would say one of the greatest things I did early in my career to really get tied in with the industry, which then, kind of was a really supportive aspect of my STEM career, was going to a couple of conferences early. And it's expensive, right? You got to save up money to travel, for hotels, to go to the conference. And on that front, I would say to people who are organizing conferences, you guys need to have student rates. And a lot of conferences already do this, but that student rate can't be like $500 instead of $2,500. That student rate needs to be the size of a bar tab, right? It needs to be $50. It needs to be a no-brainer for them to come. And the beauty of that, and I think if you take the long term or the long view, you get a bunch of students in for $50 one year, right? They come back for $50 the next year. 5 years later, they're coming back at full price, right? So it's good for the conference folks. But for the STEM folks, if you can encourage those early professionals and those college students to get to conferences, they see way more companies, they build their network, they see the exciting things, they feel the energy, they find people that they relate to, start building their own little kind of professional cohort. And I think that drives them more into STEM and solidifies that STEM, their potential success in STEM. Because as we all know, networking is a fantastic thing you can do for your career. And the larger network you have in STEM, the more successful you're going to be. And when you're more successful, you stay in it, right? You pursue it harder. So back to your question, I would say it's get out there and engage, get the students, whether they're late high school or college or early professionals, get them engaging with industry beyond their day-to-day job. Get them, and the best way to do that is conferences. And it's expensive, but find a way. I think it's great.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And I really like just to touch on what you kind of said earlier about younger children. I think that's a really great point to make. As technology kind of advances and all the capabilities that we have, I think it gives us the chance to bring these young people closer than ever to the real thing and to inspire and to illustrate. And I think really more than ever, we can put them in the shoes of these people that they might want to follow in the footsteps of. And, we've got the ties to industry, and we've got these incredible activities that are so accessible for these children to do that we can bring into them. And it can be so immersive for them now more than ever. And I think that's, I think that without a doubt, personally, I think that is what is going to inspire these young people to actually, whether it's for a few hours in a workshop, someone coming into their school, however old they are.
Yep.
That I think that could be such a defining moment when they're sat in their chair as the CEO of some sort of aerospace company. They'll say, "Oh, they're on this podcast," and say, "What was it?" And they say, "Oh, it was a course I did. It was a little workshop I did when I was 10 years old." And it's so important. They're so young, but that's when we need to be nurturing this. And kind of go on to what you said later about the kind of the conferences and the importance of getting young people involved in that. I completely agree with you there, because I think that, as you said, networking and collaboration and being able to speak to people and learn from people is the most, I think that personally, I believe that's the most valuable tool, and that's what you can learn the most from. And that's actually something that I would quite like to ask you about, funnily enough.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd be really interested personally, and I think anyone listening that might want to follow in your footsteps would be really interested to know is, what would you say were the best resources that you've identified and utilized over the years, whether, it was, as we said, courses, conferences, programs, mentors, anything that helped you segue into the sector?
Yeah, really good question. And, I've thought a little bit about that just because other folks have asked me, right? Like interns that we've had at TrustPoint have kind of said, hey, what can I do during the school year to kind of progress my career? And I think there's a couple of really nice periodicals where you got to find. So we're talking STEM in general. Of course, I'm thinking about space. And I think, getting a subscription to a periodical in space. So, early on, I bought a subscription to Space News, and it kept me kind of on the forefront of what was going on. I didn't read it all every time it came out. I didn't have that amount of time available. But I'd see articles and I'd stay up with it. I subscribed to a couple of different space-related news blogs. And keeping an eye on kind of where the industry is going, what cool things are happening was both kind of motivational, but it also kind of just created leads for my career, right? To the point where I was like, oh, that's a cool company. Maybe I should go talk to them next time I'm looking for a job. Or, yeah, that's a cool company. And then on LinkedIn, you see a buddy of yours just started working there. And now you're like, oh, I know what he's doing or she's doing, and now I can go talk to them. So I think being in touch with news in your sector, in your STEM sector, is very important, and finding a nice way, an efficient way to do that would be valuable. In aerospace, I found great success with Space News. I think there are other really nice kind of daily newsletters that have come out and other, recently that have been good as well. But Space News was kind of the preeminent, and I think still kind of the premier, at least here for the US, capability of kind of sharing that updated news. I'd say another resource is looking for kind of continuing education opportunities, right? And I started grad school part-time remote and then finished full-time. I got a bunch of friends and colleagues that did, their grad work part-time, or, just additional classes to learn new skills. And I think a lot of people, or at least definitely I did when I initially got out of school, undergrad, I was kind of like, all right, I'm done with class. I'm done with learning. I want to go do something real. And when I started grad school, I was a little worried. It was like, all right, I need to go to grad school for my career. I'm a little worried about going back to class. Like, am I going to really enjoy this? But I was able to find a pretty kind of flexible program and pick classes that were valuable to my career that I found super interesting, right? It's not as restrictive or constrictive as an undergrad program that's trying to give you kind of a broad education plus a sector-specific set of skills. This is very much a sector-specific set of skills that you kind of get to cherry pick sometimes. So I would encourage folks to start looking at continuing education. It sounds silly, but taking a class on machine learning or taking a class on business strategy, it's super valuable. And I found in my career, when I started my part-time grad work, I would take a class, and because I was working during the day and doing classes at night and on the weekends, I would take stuff out of my classes and apply it the next day at work, right? Partially just to see, hey, does this work in the real world? Often it did, right? There's a reason they're teaching it. And I found that very valuable. So I would encourage folks to look for, not necessarily full-time grad school. That's fantastic as well, but part-time or kind of temporary kind of professional learning activities. The other thing I would say is mentoring is huge as a resource, and you got to kind of build that for yourself. I did something, and I won't say this always works. It really depends on the culture that you're in when you're at a company looking for mentors. But be open about your goals and aspirations as you look for mentors, because there's going to be mentors that kind of see that and go, oh, that's really exciting. I got this young, motivated, energetic person. I'm going to bring them onto my programs. I'm going to give them opportunities to lead, to prove themselves, more responsibilities, right? That helps build a resume. But you can also get the folks that have kind of gone through that same trajectory that you're talking about, right? So as a junior engineer at Orbital Sciences, I went around and I told people, I was like, I love working as an engineer, but I want to run one of these companies someday. And there's, a good percentage of the people were like, all right, don't get ahead of yourself here, Patrick. You're too far out over your skis. You're a junior engineer, you're going to do junior engineering work. And that's what I did do, junior engineering work, right? But then there's a handful of folks that are like, oh, I like that, right? And they would send little opportunities my way. And if you stack enough of those opportunities up, you can accelerate your career pretty nicely. So, I'd say find some mentors, do that by being open with what your aspirations are and your interests are. And it might bite you in the butt every now and then. I'm not going to lie. There were some people who did not like how ambitious I was. And I don't know, I wouldn't say they were threatened. I just think they were like, hey, we got a job to do. Like, I don't want you thinking about 10 years from now. I want you thinking about the deliverable next Friday. But the other side of that is, as long as you keep hitting your deliverables, the folks that are good, strong leaders and you want to be your mentor are going to recognize, hey, this guy delivers and he has aspiration. That's the type of person we need on the team. So, that'd be my comment. And then stay in touch with those people, right? I got a couple of mentors from orbital sciences I still reach back to, one on the technical side, one on the business side. And you got to put effort into that. And I'm not particularly good at that, but I think it's super valuable because as your career grows, things pop up. You have questions, you need a little bit of help, you need an intro, you need some folks to bounce some stuff off that are kind of, professionally centric and minded that understand your career and your process, and having a couple of folks in your back pocket that you've talked to in the last month or two that you can just call on a random day and say, hey, you got 15 minutes to hear this. That becomes a super useful thing to have. And I would say, especially for an entrepreneur, nothing is more valuable at the early stage of a business than your network, because you're solving a ton of problems. You need a ton of people. Hiring is hard. And the best way to do that is to leverage your network. So that'd be the last thing. Push for mentors and stay in touch with them.
Completely. I think that's a really great point to make. And I love the kind of, I think there's kind of a theme there towards that kind of, throughout that answer that you gave. I love the kind of analogy of the continued education and the keeping up with the space news and seeing all the exciting developments, because you never know what's going to interest you. And it could be something that you didn't know existed, and you never know what you're going to love. And if you keep up with the exciting things that are going on in the sector, and if you enroll yourself in a course that you find interesting, you never ever know what you'll end up loving. And if you keep following these interests and have a keen current interest in what's going on and the drive, as you said, some people might not like that, but you wouldn't be where you are now if you didn't do that. So good thing you did. And I think once you've kind of built this idea for yourself, and alongside you're building maybe a network and there's mentors that you've met, I think they do mentors, I think in the space sector, especially when, if lower level people come to them and say, I have big dreams. I think a lot of the time they see themselves in that person, and they want to help and they want to mentor them, and they want to tell them how they can sidestep obstacles that, maybe they experience themselves, that they wish that someone had been there to kind of help them out. So yeah, I just love that analogy of, just having an open mind, keeping up with it, and just seeing where it takes you. And I feel that your path was somewhat winding, but it must have been so interesting the whole time. And I think that gives you a really interesting insight and some really valuable kind of insights and advice that you could give to people. So that's I think something that would be really great for us to touch on, is advice that you would give to someone from either a technical or a non-technical background who's looking to enter the sector, either in this year or beyond.
Yeah. In just a couple of words, dive right in, right? Don't be afraid of it. I think, there are folks that change jobs and, there's a little hesitation there or anxiety about, oh my God, I got a nice job now, I'm making a good paycheck. I know the area I live in, but I really want to work for this company halfway across the country, doing something completely different. Right. And I think it's worth saying, if you've got a good head on your shoulders and you're excited about that, you're going to have the skill sets and the capability to do well. Right. And if you don't do well, but you work hard, there's going to be other opportunities at that company or in that vicinity that are going to be valuable to you. And you just pivot to that. That's perfectly normal, right? People are doing that all the time. And so I would say dive right in, and, recognize, especially in space, the sector is growing. There's way more work than there are people in the industry to do that work. So if you're coming in with or without a technical degree, there's a lot available. Right there, you guys are in this sector, right? There's massive demand for people, and if you can show up and learn those skill sets, on the job, people are going to hire you to do that. I did that. I hired a couple of guys on my previous job that had no technical background from the standpoint of formal engineering education. Right? They worked with their hands. They worked on technical systems, but they had no space background. Right? They had no engineering background, no real program management background. And, I interviewed them and they were super energized about the job. They had a ton of energy to invest to learn. We hired them, we got them trained up on the job, and they were fantastic professionals for the company, right? And over time, they gained more and more technical skills, which is what we needed. But we didn't need that on day zero per se. But it's absolutely something we were expecting within 12 and 18 months, and that's what we got. So I think a lot of people can do that, and that would be, I'd encourage folks that maybe are thinking about it just to dive in and see where it goes. I think there's so many different opportunities. It's really hard to go wrong. The other thing I would say is if you're interested and you don't know where to start or where to dive in, I think it comes back to the conference thing. Self-fund conference attendance, and I'd recommend folks that are interested in the aerospace industry to go to SmallSat in Utah, or maybe Satellite Show in DC. There's a few others that are really good too, around the country, that are smaller. But those two are the big ones to really get kind of exposed to a lot of companies and a lot of people. And, just networking a bit, having a beer with someone, a cup of coffee, walking around the exhibit hall, meeting companies, will give you those opportunities to dive in, right? And I will tell you, if I'm at an exhibit booth now or doing it and some student or young professional walks up and says, "Hi, I really would like to work for a company like yours," right? That's absolutely someone I want to meet, right? I want to put them in our HR pipeline. Maybe I don't have a job for them today, but people who are motivated to come work at a company like TrustPoint are someone I want to stay in touch with. I think that categorically would go across all of the aerospace industry, right? There's not going to be a lot of companies that are like, "Oh yeah, don't show interest in working for me," right?
Yeah.
Especially with how fast the industry is growing. So dive right in. The last thing I'll say is, be a nerd, be a geek about space, and get into it. Enjoy it. I saw a post on social media the other day discussing the differences between a geek and a nerd. I don't know how much this applies, but bear with me for a second. Nerds are hands-on, right? They're very much tied in with the technology, the capability. They're doing stuff. But a slightly higher level of that, kind of a little abstracted off, are geeks, and geeks are super fans, right? And they're a fan of technology. They're a fan of the applications. They like the players. They follow the news. And anyone can be a geek, right? And being a geek is kind of the first step to being a nerd. And nerds, for all intents and purposes, is what this industry is comprised of, right? And it's definitely expanding beyond that. We have some fantastic professionals that I don't think would self-categorize as nerds, and you need that as well. But I think for the early folks, getting in and being a fan of the industry, again, it comes back to space news, comes back to going to conferences. Dive right in, be a fan of it first, and get in it and be a driver. So that's my recommendation.
I think we're all space nerds, geeks. I think surely on some level to be working in this, you got to be. How can you not be? It's nothing to be ashamed of. I think it's amazing, and I love the dive right in. I think that says it all really, because as you said, it's a growing sector. It's massively expanding rapidly, and you can learn on the job, and people will give you the opportunity to do so if you're keen and if you're enthusiastic, because that's what they want in their company, and that's what they want. And I'm sure they were that person at one time that maybe, was thinking, do I have the experience for this? And just went up to that person and thought, do you know what, I'm just going to do this. I'm going to say it. And the amount of people that I bet one little conversation that maybe they had to force themselves to have probably changed the entire trajectory of their life. And like we've kind of touched on, even if you don't have the technical experience, coming from someone that works in space sector recruitment, you don't need to be a scientist. You don't need to be an engineer. I'm not a scientist or an engineer. I've got an English literature degree and I'm a copywriter. You need marketing executives, you need media specialists, you need business developers, we need people in sales. So if you want to work in space, don't be put off if you're not a science person, if you're not that way inclined mentally and intellectually, because that's not the only measure of intelligence and the only way you can succeed in the industry. So I think exactly how you said, just just have the conversation, be bold, dive right in. It really says it all. I think that's really, really great advice. Final thing, Patrick, I wanted to ask you, it's kind of more of an overarching question, kind of more specific to your industry and also looking forward. I just would be very interested to know on your thoughts on the current state of, well, the space industry, but maybe more specifically the use of kind of growingly commercialized GPS, and how do you see that evolving in the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, so I think Yes. All right. So we talk GPS for a second, right? There's a little bit of
Yes.
variety today, right? You get the GPS system, you get the Galileo system, Beidou in China, GLONASS out of Russia. There's a couple of regional systems too, in Japan and India. And these are great systems, right? But the variety is pretty low, right? We're talking about six systems, give or take, two of which are only kind of partial, maybe three are partial. And they all kind of do the same thing. All the signals are in the same frequency. All the signals look roughly the same. There's some different modulation schemes and other things if you want to get technical about it. But for the most part, it's a similar system, similar service. In GPS, I think what we're going to get for position, navigation, and timing, PNT is kind of the acronym used more at a kind of a more abstracted level than GPS. For PNT, I think we're going to get a lot more specialized systems, right? We're going to see diversification, right? There's some great examples of this. If you look at internet, 20 years ago, right? We all kind of had dial-up modems, 33.6K, was it 55K modems? Everyone's internet looked and felt the same. There's a few folks with a T1 line, right? Back in the day. But for the most part, it looked and felt the same. Today, internet is so diverse, right? Getting any sort of internet access can be wireless over Wi-Fi, 4G, 5G, broadband from space, hardline, fiber, coax. And each of those has optimization for different types of users, right? Or different applications. And so we have a massive variety in kind of general internet access. But for GPS and timing, it's kind of one flavor, one size fits all currently. But that's not optimal, right? So I think in GPS, we're going to get something that is much more diverse. And as costs come down for launch and for spacecraft, people will be able to provide multiple services from multiple sectors, right? I think a GPS service for an IoT device looks very different than an automotive car, looks very different from a military user, looks very different from a large commercial aircraft. All of them have different requirements, different pain points, and it doesn't, you can't necessarily serve all of those customers with the same service. So I see kind of in 5 to 10 years time, us having a much wider variety, many more options for GPS-like capabilities, enabled by commercial players like TrustPoint. And I think TrustPoint will have a few different flavors in the long run that we'll be able to provide to both grow our business, but also to give, the optimal capability to the user segments we're serving.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think TrustPoint are really at the forefront of a very, very exciting, emerging and crucial, I think most importantly, vital staple of modern life. It's the sector of what you're doing. And I think it affects everyone. And I think every single person, whether you're in the sector or you're not, we can all relate to and we all understand the issues that TrustPoint is working to solve. And I think are definitely going to do so. And I'm just very excited to see where this takes us.
Yeah.
Very, very excited for you guys as a company. We established 2020, am I right?
Yeah. We founded in 2020, raised a seed round late last summer, early fall timeframe. We're about a team of 10 now. So yeah, we're still very new, very young. I'd encourage anyone that's listening that wants to learn more to reach out either through our website or over LinkedIn. And of course, we do internships. So for students out there, let us know. And we'll also be hiring over the next couple of years. So we'll have plenty of job recs out for folks. And we'll probably want to talk to you guys at EVONA as well about some of those. So a lot of opportunity, and we are young and growing. So if you want to get in on the ground floor or the first floor of what I believe is going to be a pretty exciting ride, now's the time.
Well, I know we do. I know EVONA would absolutely love to work with you, and I think after that offering, I think you might be inundated with LinkedIn messages quite soon.
I hope so. Yeah. The Patrick Shannon, if searching on LinkedIn, that's the easy one there. And then for TrustPoint, the shameless plug, trustpointgps.com. Pretty easy URL there.
Well, there, an open invitation for anyone listening to, as we said, dive right in, ask the question, because you never know where it's going to take you.
Yeah. Yep. Absolutely.
Amazing. Well, Patrick, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been I've really, really enjoyed speaking to you. Such an interesting conversation that I'm actually going to go and research more about now.
Absolutely. Please do. Again, thank you for the invite to be on. Happy to share my thoughts. Really excited to have been here and for that opportunity.
Yes, me too. It was an absolute pleasure, Patrick. Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your day.
You too.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.